Imagine this, the streets of the 1950s, filled with cars, all different, yet at the same time, strangely similar. They weren't the fastest, they weren't the most luxurious, and many of them weren't even the most beautiful. But they were the ones everyone bought, the ones on every corner, in every garage, in every ordinary story that almost no one tells. And here's the interesting part. When you understand why these cars sold so much, you don't just understand the cars, you understand an entire generation. Because sometimes, the most important car of an era isn't the most desired, it's the most chosen. And some of them are going to surprise you. 1957. Chevrolet Bel Air. It didn't just look like a popular car, it looked like a symbol. Chrome everywhere, long, elegant lines, a presence that, even today, still turns heads. But here's what makes it interesting. This car wasn't exclusive, it wasn't rare, it wasn't out of reach. It was the opposite. It was the car people felt they could actually own, and that changed everything. The numbers make it even clearer. In 1957 alone, the Bel Air surpassed 700,000 units produced, a massive figure for the time, especially for a car that wasn't the base model of the lineup. And that's what makes it even more interesting. It wasn't just the cheapest option, it was the car people truly wanted. At a time when the country was experiencing one of its biggest economic expansions, the middle class was growing, and suddenly, owning a beautiful car was no longer an impossible luxury, and Chevrolet understood that better than anyone, because the Bel Air wasn't the cheapest, but it wasn't expensive either. It sat perfectly in that sweet spot, where it looked like more than it actually cost, and that made it irresistible. But here's something important. This wasn't just about looks. Under the hood, there were options that didn't quite match that image of a refined family car. V8 engines, including the famous 283, with numbers that, for the time, were already becoming serious. Over 200 horsepower, and acceleration that, in the 1950s, didn't go unnoticed. But what made it interesting wasn't just what it did, it was how it did it. Because this car didn't shout speed, it delivered it smoothly, without drama, without exaggeration, as if it had nothing to prove. And that's where everything comes together. Because the Bel Air didn't just sell a car, it sold a feeling. The feeling of having reached something better, of having more without looking excessive. And that's why it was everywhere. Not because it was the best at everything, but because it was the perfect balance between desire and reality. And that is exactly what most people were looking for at the time. 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe. This car didn't try to stand out. It tried to be everywhere. And it succeeded, because unlike the Bel Air, there was no excess here, no obvious luxury, no intention to look like more than it was. It was simple, direct, functional, and that's exactly why it worked so well. In the early 1950s, the United States was still settling into the post-war era, and what people were looking for wasn't attention. It was stability, confidence, something that simply worked every day, and Ford understood that perfectly. Because the Custom Deluxe wasn't exciting, but it was exactly the car people needed, and the numbers prove it. In 1950 alone, Ford surpassed 1.1 million passenger cars produced, with the Custom Deluxe being one of the pillars of that volume. It was everywhere, not because it was special, but because it was accessible, reliable, and easy to maintain. But here's something important. That doesn't mean it was weak. Under the hood, options like Ford's classic flathead V8 produced around 100 horsepower, enough to move the car with ease, without complications. It wasn't fast, it didn't try to be, but it didn't need to, because this car didn't sell speed. It sold peace of mind, the confidence of knowing you would get there every single day without surprises. And that's where the real contrast lies. While some cars tried to stand out, this one simply delivered, and still, it dominated the streets, because sometimes the best-selling car isn't the most exciting one. It's the one that fails the least. 1953 Chevrolet 210. This car lived in a very interesting middle ground. It wasn't the cheapest, but it wasn't the most desirable either. And still, it was one of the most common sights on the streets, because this is where a lot of people made a smart decision. The Bel Air might have looked better, more elegant, more complete, but the 210 did almost the same for less, and that made it the logical choice. In a time when every dollar mattered, this kind of balance made all the difference. And Chevrolet knew it, because the 210 didn't try to impress, it tried to convince. And it did it very well. The numbers reflect that. In the early 1950s, Chevrolet consistently surpassed 1 million units per year, and the 210 was a key part of that volume. It was everywhere, not because it stood out, but because it fit perfectly into people's lives. But here's where it gets interesting, because this car wasn't as basic as it seemed. Under the hood, inline-six options, and later V8 versions, with power figures exceeding 100 horsepower, enough to offer more than just simple transportation. It wasn't an exciting car, but it had more than it appeared, and that made it even more appealing. Because you weren't paying for image, you were paying for common sense. And that's the contrast. It wasn't the car people dreamed of owning, it was the car people chose to own. And that is far more powerful than it seems. And now things get interesting, because so far, we've seen cars that sold through logic, through balance, through necessity. But the next one is the opposite, a car almost no one remembers today. But at the time, it was everywhere. And here I want to hear your opinion. If you had to choose between something rational, like this 210, or something completely forgotten, but just as present in its time, which one would you pick? Because what comes next doesn't seem important, but it was. 1951, Plymouth Cranbrook. This car didn't try to convince you, or impress you, or even stand out. It simply was there, on every street, in every neighborhood, in every routine. And that wasn't by accident, because Plymouth understood something many brands overlooked. Not everyone wanted to aspire to something more. Many people just wanted something that worked, something reliable, something affordable, something that didn't complicate their lives. And the Cranbrook was exactly that. No excessive chrome, no exaggerated lines, no pretension. A clean design, proper, almost discreet. But here's where it gets interesting, because that simplicity was its greatest strength. The numbers make it clear. In the early 1950s, Plymouth produced hundreds of thousands of units per year, and the Cranbrook was one of its most important models. It wasn't rare, it wasn't special, but it was everywhere. And that says everything. Under the hood, 6-cylinder engines with just over 90 horsepower, no big numbers, no intention to impress, but with something far more important, durability. This car wasn't built to be fast, it was built to last, to start every morning without failing, without surprises. And that's where everything comes together, because while other cars tried to stand out, this one became part of everyday life, quietly, without attention, but always present. And that's the strongest contrast of all, because it wasn't the car anyone dreamed of owning, but it was probably the car most people actually had. 1955, Chevrolet 150. This car wasn't built to impress, or to turn heads, or even to look like more than it was, and still, it became one of the most common sights on the streets. Because this is where things get even more interesting. If the Bel Air was the car people desired, and the 210 was the car people chose logically, the 150 was the car that simply made sense. It was the most basic version, the most direct, the most honest in the entire Chevrolet lineup. No excess, no unnecessary details, nothing that wasn't absolutely essential. And that made it extremely attractive to thousands of people, especially for those who needed a car to work. The numbers make it clear. By the mid-1950s, Chevrolet was producing over 1.5 million cars per year, and the 150 was a fundamental part of that volume. Not because it was the most beautiful or the best equipped, but because it was the most accessible. But here's the detail many don't expect. Because even as the most basic version, this car could hide more than it seemed. Under the hood, from reliable inline-six engines to V8 options like the 265 with over 160 horsepower, something that, at the time, was already becoming serious. But what's interesting is how it delivered that power. It didn't chase excitement. It didn't aim for spectacle. It simply did its job. It accelerated when it needed to. It responded when you asked it to, without complications. And that's where the real contrast lies. Because this car didn't sell an idea. It didn't sell aspiration. It didn't sell emotion. It sold something much simpler, pure functionality. And precisely because of that, it ended up becoming one of the most common cars of the entire decade. Not because people loved it, but because people needed it. 1956, Ford Fairlane. This car wasn't basic, but it wasn't luxury either. And right there is where everything changes. Because the Fairlane lived exactly in that space, where people started looking a little higher. It was no longer just about having a car. It was about having something better, something that said a little more, without going too far. And Ford understood that moment perfectly, because the Fairlane wasn't out of reach, but it clearly wasn't the cheapest option. It had more presence, more detail, more intention to stand out, stronger chrome accents, more elegant lines, a more refined overall feel. It was the kind of car that didn't need to be extreme to feel different, and that made it very appealing. The numbers confirm it. By the mid-1950s, Ford was producing over 1.4 million cars per year, and the Fairlane positioned itself as one of the most desirable options for the general public. It wasn't the most common, but it was one of the most aspirational within reach. But here's something important. This car wasn't just about looks either. Under the hood, V8 engines like the 292, with around 200 horsepower, offered performance that already felt more serious. It wasn't a sports car, but it was no longer just transportation. It had something extra. It accelerated with more intent, responded better, and above all, felt more complete. And that's where the contrast lies, because the Fairlane wasn't the car you needed. It was the car you started to want. And that, in the 1950s, made all the difference. Because it meant you were no longer just getting by. You were moving forward. And now, I want to hear from you. So far, we've seen cars that simply worked, cars that made sense, and cars that started to feel like a step up. But if you had to choose, would you go with something practical like the 150, or would you make the jump to something like the Fairlane? Because what comes next completely changes the kind of car that dominated the streets.